And now, here on Mastering Dungeons, we are getting into our main topic where we are going to continue our look at Daggerheart. We've covered the player sides of things, and now we're getting into the GM mechanics, which in games like this are going to be different than the player mechanics. So that's why it's very important that we step back and look at what the game master can do and should do and how to do those things in Daggerheart. Last time, I think we talked about some of the concepts that the game brings, but now we're going to dig down deep into those GM mechanics and the actions and the moves that the game master can take.
And I like these because while they may not have quite the breadth of appeal that the game master sort of lessons and directives did around how to approach running a game, which you can apply to lots of types of games and borrowed heavily from Apocalypse World, I think that these mechanics do also show you this attempt of where the game is, how the kind of experience the game is trying to provide. And I find that it can be hard if you haven't played games of that nature. If, like you say, you've only played D&D, it can be hard to kind of make the most out of these. And it's very, I find it very interesting to analyze these rules and see how they work. So hopefully folks listening will also feel that way.
For sure. This leads back to the question at the start of our show from Marcelo is how important is it for designers of games to play other games? And so this is our analysis of this game, but also an analysis of what lessons we can take to other games.
Yeah.
So as a reminder, as a game master in Daggerheart, you are narrating the scene and you are asking questions of the players and then responding to the questions that the players ask. When the characters take a move and there is a chance that that move may fail, this is called an action, and the players roll the dice. They roll their duality dice. If their result meets or exceeds the DC for the check, the players succeed. Otherwise, the player fails. The roll, whether it succeeds or fails, if the hope die is higher than the fear die, the player gets to mark a hope on their character sheet. If the fear die is higher, whether you succeed or fail, then the game master gets to mark a fear. And fear is a currency that the game master can then use to make life more interesting for the players.
Yeah.
So, with all that in mind, we're going to get into the GM rules. When the GM is able to act, they roll to see if their monsters or their NPCs succeed. They roll a d20 instead of the 2d12 duality dice when they're attacking. This adds some swinginess to the game master's rolls that is lacking in the player rolls, because 2d12 gives you a bell curve of results with a higher percentage hanging there in the center around 13, whereas a d20 is you have the same chance of rolling a 1 as you do a 20.
Yeah.
So after you roll that die, you add the enemy's attack modifier to the roll compared to the target's evasion score. If it hits, if you meet or exceed the evasion score, then you roll damage and put in any other consequences that the attack may have. There is an optional rule where if you roll a natural 20 on your attack roll, that is a critical hit. So you automatically succeed plus gain a fear.
Yeah. And it's worth pointing out that evasion scores tend to be pretty low, right? So I was playing this last weekend. We played the new adventure that I think is level 2. It was a lot of fun. I played with Tom of D20 Play, so you can actually see the game online if you go to the D20 Play channel. And there were a lot of really interesting lessons that I got from it, showing that this is the kind of game you need to play several times to really think through. And I found myself a lot, and Tom was also talking after the game, thinking about the GM side of things, which is perfect for this show. And it's worth noting that like the evasion score tends to be really low. My character had an 8. And so you get hit all the time, but sometimes not, because the 20 is so swingy, right? And that helps with these low evasion scores that you probably will hit as GM. But you know, 1 out of 7 out of 20 times you're going to roll lower or some number like that, depending on their attack bonus. Um, and so they did, actually miss me a couple of times, and that does happen because of that 20-sided die. Whereas the
Yeah.
2d12 would be far more likely to hit me.
Yep. And with armor, you have the chance as the player to, even if you are hit, negate most, some, or
Yeah.
all of that damage using your armor slots. And even if you take a lot of damage, there's that gated threshold where
Yep.
you generally are taking 1, maybe 2 points of damage, even on a hit.
Yep, and we can talk more about that because we've found that was very interesting. It's going to take, I think it's going to take me several games to really get a feel, or maybe a short campaign to really get a feel for how that ebb and flow works. And something that we're going to see in these rules, there's a reason why they're written the way they are. Because if you as a GM set out like D&D, every monster does exactly what it's supposed to do, right? Like it's their initiative turn, they take an action trying to kill you, right? Unless you've given them a reason otherwise, they use their best capabilities to take you down, and it's very gamist in that way, right?
Mhm.
It's tactics and it's stats aligned against one another, and the game itself is what tries to favor the PCs. In Daggerheart, you can obliterate the PCs if you want to. At least it felt that way with Tom's. What Tom had at his disposal in this adventure, he could have wiped us out. And it was sort of on him to create a great experience by deciding when the monsters did what, when he chose to use the fuel that we'll talk about. That was really in his control. And I found that really, really fascinating.
Yeah. There is a mandate in this game and in other Powered by the Apocalypse games that you, as the game master, are there to make moves that drive forward the fiction in response to the character's actions.
Mm-hmm.
So, as Teos said, I don't know how easy it is. I would have to play it a lot more to get that feel for could I kill all the characters if I really wanted to? Or is there a limit based on the rules we're about to talk about that make it possible but not easy to do?
Mm-hmm.
Now, in D&D, you can also, as the game master, kill the characters very easily by saying your character's dead. There's no rule that says you can't do that. Uh, so we have to keep in mind the balance between the two and what the game allows, both explicitly or implicitly, with the
Yeah.
rules.
Yeah.
So we are told that we as the game master will call for action rolls from the players when a character makes a move. You will sometimes call for an action roll. When might you not? If it's an uninteresting role, if there's no consequences for failure, if the task is too easy, if success is much, much more interesting than failure, you don't need to call for the action roll. You can just say you succeed and here are the consequences. It's important to remember they don't explicitly say this, but it's important to also remember that with every action roll that the characters make, they are either getting hope or you are getting fear. So allowing hundreds of rolls in a session is sort of inviting the players to all have as much hope as possible. And there is a limit, but I think it's 6. And then there is also a limit on the fear that you can have as a game master. So if it's interesting to you to all the players have all the hope they can and you have all the fear you can, then you can allow as many rolls as you want to build those
Mm-hmm.
up. But it's more interesting if you don't, if you only call for rolls when it's important to the story.
And I thought that was interesting here that they add a flip side, which we don't see in a lot of RPGs. Let the PC guarantee their success in exchange for a consequence. And that's
Mhm.
really interesting. Like, yeah, you can break down the door, but the monsters will hear you, right? Or It'll raise the alert level of this place. That's a really interesting thing that we don't usually see, right? That if a character
Mhm.
really wants to buy success, they may be able to do so. You get to decide, um,
Mhm.
and there may be no roll, right? You just say like, yeah, I want to make this jump. Well, you can do that, but there may be consequences. Oh, you drop something in the pit, right? That's an
Yeah.
interesting take.
It's an interesting take for sure, and it reinforces this sense that the objective of this game is a cool story.
Mm-hmm.
And story-wise, it's cool if A, you are able to knock the door down, because that's where the action is.
Yeah,
It's also cooler when the monsters know what's coming, because then it invites that interaction right away.
yeah,
So it gets to the gist of what's cool about these stories that we're trying to tell. And it wants those stories to happen.
yeah. And they're also saying very strongly in this, don't be a dick about it, right? Like
Mhm.
make clear what the stakes are,
Mhm.
what the consequences are if they're guaranteed, right? If you know that breaking the door down, if they should know that breaking the door down will alert the things on the other side, make that clear, right?
Mhm.
When you're doing this, whether there's a role or not, make those kinds of
Right.
consequences of the action clear when they should be clear, so that it's not a gotcha, and
Right.
it makes drives that decision, right? Should I do this or not? Right.
Yeah. And you don't have to give away the whole game, right? You don't have to
Mm,
say, if you break down this door, there are six orcs on the
right.
other side and they are going to know. You can say, you can break down the door without a check. However, if there are creatures on the other side of that door within a certain radius, they are going to hear that. So it doesn't
Hmm.
take away the surprise. It just makes a logical step that should be there anyway. Also, make clear any certain
Hmm.
consequences. So you if the player says, I want to throw my fire lantern at the enemy because maybe they're vulnerable to fire, just say, yes, you can do this, but whether your attack succeeds or fails, it is going to catch the room on fire, and that's going to be a part of the deal.
I like that one.
And again, it's the bring out the cool elements of the story and just set them so that decision
Hmm.
can be made.
One that I'm still trying to struggle with is this next one: experiences impact fiction, and the idea that you should let when you're just determining whether a role is necessary,
Mhm.
and maybe even the consequences of it, and how you would color the situation. You should consider a PC's backstory,
Mhm.
both their narrative history and their experiences. So if they chose expert climber as an experience and they're attempting to scale a wall, and there's no danger, then hey, they can just do it. But if there is something that makes the situation difficult, like the weather or they're being shot at, then you might say, hey, mark a stress if you want to climb without making a roll. Otherwise,
Mhm.
you might give them advantage, or I guess they could use their experience. They could burn hope, use their experience, and just get a bonus to the roll. So you probably wouldn't give them advantage. Um, but it's an interesting thought around that. I have in our play so far, I have not found that experiences get used that often. Like they tend to be forgotten in favor of all of the powers that they have on their sheet.
Mhm.
Um, this could partly be a lot of us are using the demiplane interface, which places those experiences on a different tab. So that may be part of it.
Yep.
But I think it's somewhat that it's not as clear a use. I think maybe because of the spend. Like I feel like in 13th Age, where this has a strong uh, similar mechanic. In 13th Age, you just sort of say, instead of choosing a skill, you just sort of say what you did. And whenever you
Mhm.
feel that comes up, well, then you just get a bonus unless your DM says otherwise. And that's nice because not having a spend means you're leaning that into a lot.
Mhm.
I find like the spend here might take away from how often experiences come up.
Yeah.
Probably over time, as a campaign rolls out, it'll work itself out and be okay. I'm not sure I love the spend part of experiences.
Yeah, I agree. I don't remember the exact wording on this, but I took it as if you have expert climber as your experience, you don't need to spend. You just here there's the wall, you climb the wall. Uh,
Yeah, in if there's no danger, I think is what they're suggesting here. But it's
okay.
a bit, and that's cool. But it also, and maybe this is a larger thing that in these rules, I often find myself wanting to say, okay, but how does that look during combat, or how does that look when it's not combat? The game, I think, tries really hard to not differentiate, like not call out combat versus not combat. But that's a little strange, right? Because it's one thing to say, oh, you have to spend an action when you're in combat, and it's one thing to say you have to spend an action when you're not in combat, because nobody cares. there's
Mm.
there's no currency to, it doesn't matter if it takes an action when I'm not worried about timing. I'm not an initiative, but saying it takes an action can matter a lot more in combat. So there are these kinds of things that sometimes the game avoids telling me the relevance and the weight of it. And I think that's one of these where when I'm in combat, spending a hope to use an experience can be a big deal, or even out of combat, because it may be a long time before I get a hope back. And so if I'm
Mhm.
spending it, maybe I only started with 2, and today we're not going to have a combat, and so I'm only going to get 1 unless I roll particularly well on something. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yep. We get next a section on making GM moves. So just as the players can make moves, so can the game master. A game master move is really anything that guides the story forward. So you can, as with a move, introduce a conflict, reveal new information, put the player characters in further danger, or anything that changes the scene in some way to make the scene more interesting or move the scene forward. And when always consider making a GM move, we're told, when a PC does the following. So if they roll with fear on an action roll, you should consider making a move to try to play up on the action of the player that just acted. So
Mm-hmm.
if they're doing this climb and they roll with fear, that's when you say, all right, you slip and you're
Mm-hmm.
barely hanging on, or a gust of wind comes through, or something to make the scene more interesting.
Yeah.
Uh, you can also consider making an action when the character fails an action roll. Again, that should be a move that you make to move the story forward based on the failure that just happened. It's okay, it's legal to use that move somewhere else, but you'd rather be reacting to what just happened rather than moving the camera somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
You can consider making a GM move when the players do something that would have a consequence, regardless of whether they succeed or fail on the roll. You are trying to rescue a basket of kittens that is sitting in a vat of acid. Unless you somehow find a way to reach that basket, you have to dive into the vat to get to them.
Yeah.
Diving into a vat of acid will have consequences, whether you make your check to swim over to the basket and rescue the kittens.
Yep. That's a great point.
Yep. Also consider making a GM move when the players give you a golden opportunity. This is one of those, obviously, this is going to happen in a story,
Yeah.
right? If a dragon is standing between you and a big pile of treasure, and you just run past the dragon to get to that pile of treasure, you are giving the game master a golden opportunity to bite you.
Yep.
And finally, consider making a GM move when a PC or the PCs look at you to find out what happens next. So you want, as we talked about with the game master description side of things, right? You want to, as the game master, talk and answer questions and give prompts for the players to talk. But if players stop talking and either refuse or don't quite know what to
Mm-hmm.
do, that's when you take your
It's great advice. It's clearly taking from apocalypse world games with these discussions of moves, and they sort of write this as taking a move first, then later what examples of what the moves are. So it can take some
Mhm.
digesting to get through this section, I think.
Mhm.
But each time they've been updating the rules, they've actually been doing a lot of sort of shuffling of what they cover when and how they
Mhm.
do the examples. So I've been very impressed by how the document has evolved over time. It's definitely getting better and better.
Right.
Um, the this concept of moves is again very different from a D&D type game where it isn't hard rules of the initiative begins or ends. It's really trying to create scenes that feed off of what's taking place, and you are guiding the story along through the things you do. You're not just responding robotically in a pattern, you're making choices. And of course, a lot of DMs will say, well, I run D&D and I do that all the time. And yet, yes, you do. You're a good DM.
Right. Yeah. That's exactly what these moves are. Um, they are things that a good game master already knows to do,
Mm-hmm.
but having a list can be informative or promptful. It can be a good prompt for you. So
Yeah.
I'm going to skip down and talk about
Mm-hmm.
those actions right now. Because when we say you as the game master make a move, this game does not mean, it does not equate making a move to attacking.
Right.
Making a move is doing one of these things. Show how the world reacts to what's happening in the scene.
Mm-hmm.
Ask a question of the players and then build on an answer. Make an NPC act in accordance with their motives. So, right, all of these things, they're not
Yeah.
attacks, they're
No.
not throwing a challenge at the characters, but they are expanding on the story, expanding on the world, moving things forward so we can get to the good stuff. Uh, Signal an imminent off-screen threat, right? You're in the dungeon, you don't quite know what to do, and then you hear a rumbling.
Yeah.
Something's up there, something's out there driving things forward. Lean on the character's goals to drive them to action, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your goal is to find the lost princess of the kingdom. You hear a rumor about a golden slipper that was found in this area,
Yeah.
driving you
Yeah.
further toward your goal.
It's a really interesting thing because if and having just played an adventure, one of the things that I find interesting is I know they need to just play test stuff, right? But their adventure is a very D&D type adventure.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing inherently wrong with it. It's good, but it doesn't kind of super allow for this. And I would
Mm-hmm.
love a playtest adventure where they try to lean into these things so that you can apply this
Mm-hmm.
right to the situation a bit more.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that D&D adventures have really done to the hobby and other RPGs do not do is D&D adventures have sort of prescribed what's going to happen to the point where you don't need to do a lot of these things because it's right there as the next obvious scene, right?
Right.
You are at the dinner table, there is going to be an event, right? An NPC is going to say a thing. So if it gets quiet, you do that thing and you just
Mm-hmm.
deploy the adventure as written. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Um, and this is trying to create a different style of play. And there's a little bit of that in the Daggerheart adventure. There is, in fact, a sort of dinner table scene. But again, it's pretty much these things are going to unlock at some point, and
Right.
rather than just fluid play or anything that has to do with the characters, right? It assumes pregens, but doesn't or does not assume pregens. It gives you pregens, and it doesn't feed off of something that the pregens or characters have, which is a big
Mhm.
part of the Daggerheart experience. So I'd love
Right.
to see how they would bring this into being in an actual adventure they would write, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and that's important to if you're teaching a game master as well as teaching the players, then you want your adventure to model that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I think you do need to get in detail with things like what is some off-screen threat that I could
Right.
present? What are
There's
some
this,
questions that I might ask the player characters to spur movement
yes.
forward?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Blade Runner doesn't have a lot of this advice, right? Like it has actually very little advice of sort of how to run the game in this kind of way. But what it does in its adventures is adventures are written to very much create this type of tension that the game is coming up with around what does it mean to be human or not human? What are those kind of moral dividing lines in society, and what should you do about it, and how do you make hard choices? All of that is set up by the way the adventures are structured without telling you how to run a great adventure necessarily, but the structure really drives towards that, right? Begs that it will happen because of the way the scenes are. And they are very open scenes. They're not this sort of prescribed thing. There's a lot of possibility it'll go one way or the other. And from one scene, you could go to maybe three different ones and stuff like that. And so I'd love to see the Daggerheart equivalent of that, of how an adventure would help you do this. I can see it in a home campaign, right? But
Right.
then we're getting into a certain type of DM that feels very comfortable sort of winging things.
Yep.
So I'd love to see that other part of it. But I like this. And I also, one last thing, I'll shut up, which is the
Yeah.
when I think of the you know, your failure generates hope, or your failure generates fear, your success generates hope, your success, I think of the Fantasy Flight dice and the Star Wars system Edge of the Empire, and how often that would become a little boring to GMs that weren't experienced with these systems, because it felt like every other role is like, and there's a complication. What is that complication? And you know, at some point you get tired of making up minor complications because they happen
Yeah.
all the time. And there is something there too as well. I think that this game could speak to a bit about what do you do when there are a lot of roles and these things come up often.
Yeah. And that's we're going to get to that question in a second because there is advice in the rules about you as the game master choosing the moves.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
the advice they give is whatever move you choose, let the characters describe their own successes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe they'll need help describing the success, but for the most part, if they succeed, let them succeed. So, and when you choose a move to make because they succeeded, but they rolled with fear, don't negate the success that they had.
Right.
Let the success stand and then add the complication as a yes, but.
Mm-hmm.
So they give it a little chart. Does the character succeed with hope? Then it's going to be yes. And the move you make will actually show more success. So not every move you make is supposed to be detrimental. It's not an antagonistic thing. Um, Now, if they succeed with fear, you can say, yes, you succeed, but because of that fear, this other thing may happen. Failure
Right.
with hope is a no, you don't succeed, but this. And then failure with fear is a no, you don't succeed, and this additional complication. And I think this is what you're saying before, Teos. What's important for this game to describe and show is how a game master new to this system spends those resources when they're allowed to, what
Mm-hmm.
they actually need to spend in order to make moves.
Yeah, and
For
both sides. There's the
example,
mechanic side of it, of sort of like, okay, I have a fear that I've gained. I can spend a fear to, have my monster do the following. That's great, right? That makes a lot of sense. But
Mhm.
but then there's also the narrative side of it, right? Like you're all,
Right.
piloting an airship, and four of you have just in rapid succession succeeded with fear.
Mhm.
How do I play off of that? Or three of you failed but with hope, right? Like how, and the coloring that can get, it could be a load, right?
Mhm.
If you don't exactly know what's expected of you and how to handle it. And I think, to me,
Yeah.
Edge of the Empire didn't, it tried, but it felt a little bit like I was supposed to come up with something every single time that
Mhm.
this happened.
Yeah. And that's why, as an adventure designer for a system, like any system, but especially this system, is within each challenge, within each encounter, within each
Mhm.
scene, you should be giving a list to the game master, if possible, of, oh, did they succeed with fear navigating the airship? Here are some things you could do.
Yeah, it's a neat idea.
So the other thing to remember is you're collecting this fear and you only spend it at very specific times. When you are outside of combat, when you are not using the action tracker, I'll get to that in a second. When you are using the action tracker, when you are not using the action tracker, let me say, you do not need to spend anything to make a move.
Hmm.
So if we're doing the airship thing and something happens, you don't need to say, well, I'm going to spend a fear. You just say the ship starts going down. Period. I don't need to spend any resources. That's just what happened. Then you may go use the action tracker because you are now in a moment by moment scene. Now you're using action tracker tokens to let the players do their thing. And then now you are spending those resources as well to throw in a complication. So you don't just use the action tracker during combat. You can use
Yeah.
it in any sort of intense moment to moment procedural scene. And that's when you start spending fear or picking action tokens off the tracker uh, to power your moves, whatever they may be.
Yeah, and it can feel a little strange that this is, a game that may appeal to very narrative DMs, and yet you do need to track these currencies in
Mhm,
some way. The good news is fear doesn't get higher than six, so you need
mhm.
at least six little tokens you can use to track fear in some way, or a die, or some other mechanism that you use to keep track of your fear total. And your fear is going to carry over across scenes, just like players. They also carry their hope across scenes. They start with two. You start with two. Um, so it's very similar rules is the good news, and then you just need a method to track it and to think when to use it. And the really important part is you're not just like we talked about. The goal isn't just to robotically execute when you have an opportunity to do so. You're trying to think of what the story calls for, what the backstory of the PCs should trigger, what their actions that they've done recently should trigger as consequences, and then playing on that. And the
Yep.
goal is within the scene and within the fiction. So one of the things we talked about with the adventure was the adventure really could have TPK'd us, but
Mhm,
that's not the story that's there. And
mhm.
so the DM is judiciously deciding when to spend their action tokens and their fear to keep the tension high, but within the not spending everything just because you have it, right? And that's an art,
Right,
right? That's an interesting reality that's different from many other RPGs where
right.
you
And
use all your resources always.
think, thinking about the action tracker, what we're talking about here, if you want to translate it to D&D, is a skill challenge.
Yeah.
Right. If you're not using the action tracker for combat, but you're counting those smaller successes, it's a skill challenge. And it's what skill challenges could have been in fourth edition if it had been more carefully designed to be
Hmm.
a system rather than a very vague blueprint that didn't quite get across its own point.
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
So we've talked about choosing the moves when you should, when you shouldn't. They differentiate between softer and harder moves.
Mm.
So the softer moves are things that propel the story forward without any real detrimental damage or consequences. It's just things that move the story forward. Whereas the harder moves are the ones that do propel the story forward, but with harsher consequences, like marking stress or making attacks or gaining fear or those sorts of things. Then we get a full list of GM moves or lists of ways that GMs should use moves. So I already started this list with show how the world reacts and ask and answer questions and then build upon that. But then as you go down the list, you get to the harder moves like show the cost of collateral damage, mark a stress or a consequence for actions, make an attack, spend action tokens, capture someone or something important. Use a character's backstory against them, take away an opportunity permanently, right? Those sorts of things are much harder moves
Yeah.
to
I mean,
pull out.
and that's such a huge difference, right? That we're saying in this game, hey, you can decide whether to take a move to say, ooh, you hear a monster, somewhere down the corridor, a loud thumping sound of something coming this way, versus saying, I'm going to force you to split up, or this resource you had it breaks and it's gone, right? Those are really different, totally
Mhm.
different levels. These are not equal.
Right.
you know
Yeah.
these are not an equal set of balanced moves. They're really for you to choose carefully based on what will work.
Yep. Yep. Then we get a section of the rules on fear itself. We have nothing to fear, Teos, but fear
Except
itself.
fear itself.
Uh, exactly. So while the players gain hope, the game master gains fear. And both of those things, hope for the players and fear for the game master, gives them the currency to spend on making the choices of what moves to make and how those moves affect the story. You start the game with two fears, the game master, just as the players start the game with two hope. When a player character rolls with fear, you gain a fear to make your game master moves with. You can also, during use of the action tracker, convert two action tokens from the tracker into one fear, and you can never have more than six fear at once. When you spend a fear, you can do these following things. You can interrupt the PCs during combat to take an action. You can add two tokens to the action tracker, just as you could take two action tokens off to gain a fear. Adversaries may have a fear move in their stat block. So you spend a fear, they get to do that move. And the environment in which a scene takes place could have a fear move that you can spend a fear to invoke that environmental move.
And to be honest, this is a lot, right? Like just
Mhm.
even the choice of that I can convert action tokens to fear, or fear to action tokens to action to one fear. That right there, we just finished saying like, oh, there's a limit of 6, but I can store them as action tokens, right? So it's like it's sort of, there's a lot there to sort of master,
Yeah.
that is intimidating. And Tom talked about this after our game. Like, man, boy, there's kind of a lot to get wrap your head around initially, and
Right.
how much can I do at a time.
Mhm.
Some of them are simple, right? Like, yeah, you have these monsters, and monsters have fairly easy stat blocks, and they may include, hey, spend a fear to do this cool thing. So that's a real
Right.
obvious thing to do. And if the
Yep.
environment has something, then hey, you can do that. But there's a lot more that there's an art to. I mean, interrupting PCs, there's an art to it, because you can really find that your players are sort of trying to set something up, and then you are truly interrupting them. And this happened a lot in my game experience, because the initiative, under the concept of sort of like that you could possibly do two things in a row. As an example of that, I as a character have attacks and an ability to heal,
Mhm.
both actions. And I may want to story wise do both, right? I heal you, and then I go over here and I try to use my, cinder power to burn the monster to a crisp. And if I'm smart, I will try to heal first, then use
Mhm.
the attack, because the attack may generate fear. It may fail, right? There's a lot going on. So healing first is good. Um, but you may decide that I can't do both those things in a row, right? You may interrupt that with
Mhm.
your use of fear to have somebody take an action. Um,
Mhm.
and that all really changes the gameplay. And I found often an inability for me to kind of have tactics play out the way I wanted them to, even though what I
Mhm.
had at my disposal seemed very tactical. And we'll talk
Mhm.
about the action tracker, but the action tracker lets you clear a monster's condition for the
Mhm.
GM. So what I would often happen is I would use a power of mine, succeed, and restrain a creature that was trying to dive bomb us. Right? I felt very clever tactically. Then it would
Mhm.
be the GM's turn. They would spend an action token to remove that condition, and they would dive bomb us. And I'd think to myself, well, what was the point of what I did?
Mhm.
Yes, I
Well,
consumed their action tokens,
yeah,
but it feels very lame, right? And so there's some,
yeah. So in order for the game master to do that, they need to spend the action,
yeah.
which is fine. They also need to spend the fear to be able to interrupt you. So depending on, and this is one of the
Well,
quirks
here's
of
a
the game.
question. But do you have to
Yeah,
spend a fear to take any move?
you have to. Here's what happened in our game
Yeah.
is we rolled one after another, after another, after another with hope. That never gave our game master the ability to interrupt
To
us.
just go, yeah. But they can
So
also just
what
choose to go.
what the game master would have to do is take two action tokens off
Mm-hmm.
to gain the fear with which to interrupt us. But that reduced the
Mm,
actions that the game master could take once they actually got the chance to interrupt us.
okay.
So we would all go once, twice, three times
Huh.
until there were seven action tokens on the board, and we never once rolled with fear. So finally, Chris had to say, well, I'm going to take two action tokens. I gain a fear. Now I can spend this fear to interrupt, and I can use all of these actions that are on the board. So it was a strange
Yeah.
it if the opposite happened, which I think happened with you in your first game, where
Mm-hmm.
you were rolling with fear
All the
constantly.
time.
So the game master was always able to take the fear, interrupt, and then use the action. Maybe there's only one on the board
Mm-hmm.
to do the one thing
One
that
thing, yeah.
they could.
Yeah, which was kind
So
of how
it's
that combat was like. They were going every other character because I guess they had an
right.
action token from a character having gone. They would roll with fear or fail. That would generate the fear that they needed to go again, and now they had an action and just kept going right after us, and it felt very choppy,
Mhm.
like we never got any fluidity because we were constantly interrupted. But the important part is the DM can choose whether to do that or not. It doesn't have to.
Correct. Correct. So the action
Mm.
tracker is pretty much what we just described. When you when the players take an action, they put an action token on the action tracker. They roll dice, do whatever the consequences of that action are. And then the game master can choose to, if they have the fear to interrupt, and then they will generally spend action tokens or more fear to trigger a fear effect uh, from the monster, from the adversary, or pick up an action token with which they can then take actions on behalf of the adversaries that they're playing. Uh,
And speaking to that kind of skill challenge that you invoked, the 4E skill challenges, the action tracker it's made here, it says here, can be used even if it's not really combat that we're talking about, right? So you can
yeah.
choose other reasons to bring out the action tracker and follow those actions so that something can take actions to oppose the characters, right? So anytime you want to do that, even if it's not really that we're fighting each other, you could do so with
Mhm.
this.
Yep. And there's a section on setting difficulties where 5 is very easy, 10 is easy, 15 medium, 20 hard, 25 very hard, or 30 nearly impossible. They suggest that you could also set up sort of a degree of success and failure,
Mm-hmm.
whereas if you beat a 25, you succeed unconditionally, whereas lower ones may have different grades of success. They don't even give a real good example of that, which I would have liked to see,
Mm-hmm.
but it's there. You can also, rather than use a static number to determine the difficulty of doing something to an NPC, you could roll a 20-sider and then just add any experiences or abilities that the monsters have to make it a little less just static. And to do that, you just roll a d20, add the relevant experience, and that's the number that the characters are trying to um, beat. It makes it a little more swingy, but it's an option there. And there's a section on giving advantage versus changing difficulty numbers. So it says you can do either. If for some reason the characters have a the right tool for the job, and decide whether you want to give advantage to them, which is let them roll a d6 as well as their duality dice, or just change the difficulty number. It can be the sort of the same thing, but it's more fun for players to feel the excitement of having this to roll that six-sider as opposed to you just lowering the difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the advice that's given for those checks. That's
Countdowns
right.
are a fun optional system that comes into this as well, where you can use a countdown die, 10, 9, 8, whatever, to track down towards a certain event, towards an adversary taking a move or a consequence. So it's just an optional way to approach scenarios. And they do say some stat blocks or adventures will call for them, but you can feel free to add them when you think that's necessary. And you can have consequence countdowns. So, like, failure with fear will move the countdown down 2. Failure with hope or success with fear will take it down 1, right? So, like, you do both bad things, failure and fear, that's 2, otherwise it's 1, or you succeed with hope, maybe it could even pull it back the other way. And those things may, like, it's almost like a doom clock that when things hit a certain level, then something's going to happen, right? A pulse of necrotic energy from the ritual gathering power or whatever it is that you're counting down. You can loop it. So each time it reaches 0, a bad thing happens again and again on this countdown, and you could use a smaller die to track that if you want it to happen more often. Countdowns for chases as the range band of distance, and they provide an example where the roll results drives the progress or lack thereof in the chase. They have under optional GM rules some different things, including underwater combat, and they suggest using a countdown die for breathing when you're fighting underwater. And each PC ticks their own die down when they take an action. And additionally, if they have a failure or fear. And that is way more fun than a lot of underwater rules, right? Because now you're really looking at this. And if you get to the countdown, you mark a stress and then you can reset it, right? So what you're really taking is stress, which if you reach too much, you're in trouble. So you're going through this. And I like that a lot. That was a really kind of neat mechanic that's very tangible. So the uses of countdowns is another clever mechanic here the game pulls in.
Blades in the Dark is famous for using sort of clocks and
Clocks.
timers and countdowns. And what this does, we talk about initiative systems and how in D&D this starts at the top at the initiative count 20, the monster layer breathes, or on initiative count 0, this happens. This is the response to that. Since we don't have a cyclical initiative, it's let's do a countdown. And it's fun because it's just a touch more chaotic than knowing that it's always going to happen at this. It's, if all 3 of us roll with fear, that's 3 ticks down and the volcano erupts again. But if none of us roll it, then we have a little more time. So it adds that a little bit of chaos to the story, which is, I think, preferable to many players out there.
Love it.
All right. With that, we will end this episode. Next time, if we talk about Daggerheart, we will be talking about running sessions and running campaigns. So thank you out there in listener land for putting up with us for yet another week. If you really like putting up with us, you can become a patron of the show. That keeps us going. It helps Teos do the editing. It helps me sober up for an afternoon and
it gets to decide. You can decide things like, should we both wear black?
Exactly. And obviously someone decided that we should this week. You can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/masteringdnd. We have many, many folks who have done so. Thank you to those who have done so at the Master of Dungeons level. We really appreciate that support. A special shout out in our show notes go to the Master of Realms supporters. And to our Masters of the Multiverse, you get a shout out right now. Keith Ammon of the Monsters Know What They're Doing, Lou Anders of Lazy Wolf Studios, Craig Bailey, David Bastiensen, Steve Bissonette, Merrick Blackman, Calvin Bridges Avalos, Evil John, Will Doyle, Andy Edmonds at nerdronomicon.com, The Mighty Jerd, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Sean Hurst, Brian King, Jim Klingler, aka DM Prime Mover, Chad Lynch, the Mathemagician, Eric Mengi, Trey McLemore, John Mickey, Shawn Molly, Falcon Neal, Tom Nelson, creator of the Deck of Player Safety, Mike Olson, Mighty Zeus, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Robert Pasley, Vladimir Prenner from Croatia, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Ross Sandberg, Andy Shockney, Krishna Simonse, Jeremy Talman from the D&D and TV podcast, Trace, Joe Tyler, Marcelo de Velasquez, the Valiant DM, James Walton, Graham Ward, Javier Waziak, and Chris Webster. Thank you all so much for your support. And as I said, yes, you could become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/masteringdnd. You can also help us out by leaving us comments and reviews on Apple Podcast, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/@masteringdungeons. Teos, tell us about what you're up to.
Ooh, well, you can go check out Success in RPGs, where I finished the second parter on how to successfully freelance, both how to land jobs and how to create projects. And very soon, I will, probably later this week, I'm going to put out a video that looks at what the Neverwinter MMO can add to the Vecna Ruin adventure, because the Neverwinter MMO actually has a ton of stuff on the graveyard in Neverwinter, which is part of one of the early parts of that adventure. So if you are doing Vecna Eve of Ruin, that may be of interest to you.
Awesome. You can find me on all the social medias at Shawn Merwin, or follow the show on the socials at Mastering DND. So I know what we're going to do next, Teos, because you're going to be on the Eldritch Lorecast tonight. Yeah. So
That
we're gonna
means,
have some fun. We're gonna have some fun there, and let's both wear black. What do you say?
ooh, that sounds great idea. And every move I'm going to take, Shawn, hard move.
And I'm going to roll with lots of fear.